Welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today, we welcome back on the show Natasha Khalid. She is an internal medicine resident in Pakistan, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, Pay Heed to the Little Life Traumas That Hit Us Daily. Natasha, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me again.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit, but for those who didn't listen to our first episode, can you just briefly share your story and journey to where you are today?
So I'm a physician based in Pakistan. I am currently doing my internal medicine residency in internal medicine at the Indus Hospital, Karachi. And besides that, I love writing, and I've been a part of the Narrative Medicine Society for the past, let's say, 5 to 7 years with many published articles.
So we're speaking towards the end of January now. Tell me what practice is like in Pakistan today.
It's actually quite tough because the number of patients keep increasing day by day, right? And especially with COVID coming along, it gets difficult to isolate a certain set of people from, let's say, COVID and non-COVID, so just ensuring that the other disease patients are not suffering from COVID or acquiring it in the hospital. So I think one of the things that we face difficulty with is in separating the two parties. And otherwise, practicing, again, like I've mentioned before, it's fun, but it's also tough because we have a huge problem with medication compliance with our patients. And that's probably because they cannot afford the medications. So even though when we can prescribe them things for their ailments, we can't get the compliance. So yeah, that's one of the biggest struggles we feel.
Now we are entering our third year of COVID, and that's the majority so far of your internal medicine training. Talk in general, how has COVID affected your training as a physician?
It has affected in such a way that we can't have a lot of scheduled activities on a regular basis, right? Because we need to limit the number of residents in a room, or we have to limit the number of residents present in one time under one roof. So a lot of activities that were fun to have and required simulations and stuff in-house now have to be Zoom based, right? So even though it's there, but it's not as good as it was initially while in the non-COVID era, right? And a lot of cases for like my upcoming juniors that I see, they get shunned away because they're suffering from COVID. So let's say we're admitting a case of carbon monoxide poisoning or just basic anemia, and if he's COVID positive, then he'll go to the COVID ward where there are a set of people rotating and not the general medicine population. So I feel like it has affected on a certain level because my first 1.5 year was not a COVID year. And I feel like I got to see more cases and work was very tougher in another way. But post-COVID, there's always this COVID element that's coming along. There's always this isolation element that's coming along. And somewhere in between, we lack residents in the middle of the year because we're affected by COVID and doctors are always the first ones to acquire it. So a lot of people are under isolation. So it overburdens you in a different way than it did initially.
Let's talk about the Kevin MD article that you wrote. It's titled, Pay Heed to the Little Life Traumas That Hit Us Daily. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
So it was during last year somewhere when I was the floor senior and I was going through a lot of patients that were coming again when COVID had mellowed down and we had a good influx of patients of different varieties coming in internal medicine like they do. And that is where I saw many young deaths, which is a very unlikely thing for me. And especially young girls that were dying, which were somewhere in their mid-20s. So, there's this kid who had been electrocuted and perfectly fine and died in let's say within the next 3 hours or 6 hours of hospital admission, and there was no way to revive him. And I think that moment, it just came to my mind. There's such a common thing while growing up in Pakistan, basically, that there's this water system that people have in which they have to turn on and off their electric motors. I don't know how familiar you guys are with it. And that has been a part of our lives. And, thankfully, nobody got electrocuted through that. But the fact that this kid got electrocuted and died, so this is something that could have happened to anybody. Similarly, I went through this thing in 2016. I had hepatitis E, which is, it's a kind of a jaundice. And then later on, the other year, I had hepatitis A, both the times. And I was very upset because I had to be on bed rest for a week and I wasn't used to that. So I thought that just disturbed what I was doing back then. I was taking my exams. And now I saw this girl who was somebody who was also a colleague who had gotten hepatitis E, had gotten intubated, was pregnant while that had happened, and eventually died within a month of intubation and being admitted in our hospital. So I think that was one death which affected all of us. And simultaneously, 2 weeks later, we had another similar case of a 24-year-old going through the same thing. And the data also supports that the mortality is really high. So I felt like that did make me realize a couple of years ago, I had gone through the similar thing, but I was so thankless about the fact that, oh, I recovered. I was like, no, I have to recover. I mean, there's so much I have to do. So these little things that you never pay attention to, but when you see a patient, then you're like, okay, this has happened to me and this person died. And other than that, while doing clinics, I remember this very young guy came to me and diagnosed with diabetes type 1. And he's been coming to us very regularly. And every time he comes to us and I'm like, okay, your sugars are upside down. Like, what have you been doing? And then he admits after a while that, okay, I've had juice, I've had chocolates, and it makes sense for a 16-year-old or 14-year-old to indulge into all of this. And then one day, very seriously, he's like, doctor, can you just tell me one medication that would help me curb the urge to have sweets? And, I ended up laughing in the clinic because I was like, I wish I knew this. Mm-hmm. So that is what inspired me to write this article. Like all of this was going on and I felt like the subconscious was storing in too much.
Now, when you're in a hospital and you see all these young patients unfortunately dying, how does that affect you as a physician?
It upsets me a lot. And then there is this unexplained, I'll say, depression that exists. And I think one coping mechanism is all of us residents, we talk about it. And then all of us friends, we talk about it in different hospitals. But obviously, people do have the common concept that as doctors, you see mortality so much on a daily basis, it doesn't affect you, but it does affect us. And sometimes some incidences do, like the ones I just mentioned. Some 77-year-old dying is a predicted thing, somebody who has 10 comorbids, but let's say a 21-year-old being diagnosed with something out of the blue, and then you're like, okay, his life is changing at this point. Counseling geriatric patients is easy in making them, understand how to go about things, but counseling a 21-year-old, suddenly that, okay, no more sweets, no more of this, no more of that. And then they're like, okay, what did just happen? You can't lift weights anymore. You can't do this anymore. So that's like a very limiting thing that happens.
So one of the things that you mentioned after these unfortunate cases is that you get together with your colleagues and you talk about it, you share cases. So take us into one of those meetings. What do you guys talk about and what do you say to each other to comfort each other after the unfortunate deaths of young patients?
Okay, so we don't really say stuff to comfort each other, but we do share our sentiments, which make us realize, okay, we're also connecting on the same level that it has affected us. But we're not really like saying something to comfort each other. We're discussing our incident and how it affected us. So we're having that conversation over whatever coffee breaks that we have in between. So again, I feel like all the residents should have some sort of a counseling in that matter, because mortality for worldwide residents is there. And that's also one of the reasons narrative medicine is getting such a heap around. But we discussed our sentiments about it, what we thought, how it affected us, and how things happen. But again, the next minute, there is a rush call. The next minute, there is a consult in the ER, and then which you're trying to make sense of and trying to get it sorted, so that you never have the time to process something. And that does not just limit us to residents. I think consultants are also a part of this. The nurses also go through this. Like they see something in 1 second, and the other one, they have so much of work, again, that they can't really process it. And similarly, when you're going home, there is so much of stuff that you have to do. You have to meet your parents, or you have to connect, you have to cook, you have to eat, you have to clean your own self in your room. and maybe work on the presentation, that you don't get to process things. So I feel like writing in that case has always helped me.
We're talking to Natasha Khalid. She is an internal medicine resident, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, Pay Heed to the Little Life Traumas That Hit Us Daily. Natasha, I want to talk about how writing is therapeutic for you. So tell me, what kind of stories do you write, and how exactly is that therapeutic for you after a difficult day or seeing a difficult case?
Okay, so I started off writing about social issues, and mostly things that involved a bit of psych element in them. And that further moved after my residency got a little more tough into just narrative medicine. So once, like, let's say I am narrating an event about how before a test, all of us have an anxiety and how we're cracking some joke, which also makes sense and is so apt in that moment. And similarly, if I'm talking about, let's say what a patient said to me, and in that moment, it really did make me realize or give me like a pause that was much needed. So it helps me in such a way that it brings me perspective into things or makes me feel more grounded suddenly. And when, let's say, other people get to read it, so the audience, let's say if my article gets published in your page, so the audience is so like vast. So I have people who contact me from, let's say, some other continent, and then they're talking about how they find it relatable and how sometimes they tell me their story down beneath my own article. And that just makes it more sense, like, okay, we're humans experiencing the same thing. And that way it does feel therapeutic. That way it feels more human and more relatable at the same time.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
My take-home message for the audience would be, especially the residents that are there who are going through the pandemic and dealing with COVID patients, and while they're doing that, also getting tested, is the fact that write about your experiences, because at one point, hopefully, fingers crossed, COVID would end and people would want to know how we dealt with it. So I feel like these narratives would be something they can read back into. So for the future, let's say, audience reading and trying to read back into what happened when COVID came, this could serve as a source of, information that they can use.
Thank you so much for coming back on the show and sharing your time and insight.
Thank you for having me, like always.